opened a shop for the sale of medicinal remedies, and an advertisement in the Dublin press reads as follows: Dr. Solomon in Fleet Street, having performed many cures on persons with scurvies, cancers and evils, thinks it is his duty to inform the public thereof, that his medicines may become more useful by being more generally known. The certificates in his possession can leave no room to doubt their veracity and the efficacy of his medicines.
How did you become successful?
Well,
welcome to History for the Curious. I'm Menno Reisner, and I host the internationally renowned lecturer, dynamic historian and tour guide, Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. Experience our history, confront dilemmas, and reveal the untold stories of 3,000 years of Jewish heritage, from Paris to Cairo, from the Russian Tsar to Maimonides, and from the Sinai Revelation to the French Revolution. Join the fastest growing Jewish history podcast in the world by subscribing to this channel and discovering the events that have shaped us into who we are today. And welcome back to a brand new series. Rabbi Hirsch, we had quite an eventful week the other week. It was a great experience meeting the King, and thank you to all of you who sent in the pictures of us speaking to the King at the front.
Chatting to him.
Yes. Everyone wanted to know what that long schmooze was about, because he seemed to pass everyone quickly, and we managed to hang on to him for a bit longer. And the answer is quite simple. We discussed his passion for Holocaust education. It's pretty well known that he spends considerable amount of time meeting survivors, and he's befriended a few of them. And your mutual friend, Lily Ebbert.
Hello, Shalom.
Hello, Shalom. So you spoke at the Levaya, and we informed him that you did. He sent his secretary that he couldn't make it in person, and he was very interested, and we thanked him for his passion for the cause, and it was quite the experience to have met him. Yes,
and to have our photo in newspapers across the world.
Indeed,
has to be said.
Indeed.
Yeah.
A few people asked me at the time, can you ask Rabbi Hirsch, is this a historic moment? Was this his first time visiting Golders Green?
No.
It's not, right?
No.
He's definitely opened things here before and visited centres, but probably the first time visiting the community.
And possibly as the King, it is the first time.
Right.
Remember, he was Prince Charles for many, many years.
Indeed, right. I'm not sure the Queen ever did visit us here. Did she?
She definitely drove through Hendon past Hasmo Boys' School while I was there at one stage, but that was not for a stop-off. But I mean, I am pretty likely that at some stage something was opened.
Right. Yes, and everyone did ask if we invited him as a guest on the podcast.
He needs to brush up on his history a little bit more, and then,
And his English, I mean, who would be able to understand? Anyway, we're going back to the topic of Jews and medicine. We've covered it before. Last time we covered only the Middle Ages, but this time it's the 18th and 19th century. So in this podcast terms, it's very, very recent. So already a time when Jews were being given rights, we will look at two very colourful figures, basically unknown, what they did with their lives and what they did and did not achieve. We will also be taking a halachic look at what happens when I do something which has an outcome medically that is unusual or unexpected. It's a two-part series. We are going to have two guests next week, one of whom is, of course, Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tetz. No medical series would be complete without him.
Absolutely. And we will also devote a few minutes at the end of this one to the latest from our friend, the BBC. Now, this series is dedicated by a close friend of Rabbi Tatz and myself from Yerushalayim, which we are very grateful for. Mordechai Wolff Haffkine was born on the 15th of March 1860 as Vladimir Aronovich Kafkin in the port city of Odessa. He was the fourth of 5 children born to Aaron Kafkin, a secular Jewish schoolmaster, and his very Orthodox wife, Rosalie. Rosalie died when her son was still a young child, and Haffkine was raised by his maternal grandmother, and her influence developed in him a feeling for Judaism that would exist his entire life. He went to university in Odessa and then St. Petersburg, and from 1879 to 1883 his scientific studies were under Ilya Menshnikov, who was a non-religious Jewish scientist, and who would become one of the fathers of immunology. He would share the Nobel Prize in Medicine with Paul Ehrlich, another Jew. But the political climate in the Russian Empire was hostile. He was openly a Jew, which was very rare amongst the secular intelligentsia of 19th century Russia, and he was also an active member of the Jewish League for Self-Defense in Odessa. In 1879, there was a violent anti-Semitic pogrom in the city, and he defended a Jewish home from the attacking mob. He was injured, but because of his resistance against the rioters, remember, the authorities arrested him. And he was only released after his mentor, Mechnikov, intervened on his behalf. And then Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881. We've mentioned this in previous podcasts. And the government carried out a crackdown on any individuals deemed politically suspicious. As a result, university forced Mechnikov to resign because he was Jewish, and at that time, Haffkine, showing the type of courage that he would use later in life, he led a student protest against the administration. He was himself expelled. He waged a legal battle against the university, and they were forced to award him his PhD, which happened in 1884. He was only 23 years old.
But from then on, I'm sure he becomes a marked man.
Yes, and until 1888, even though he has what you might call basic employment at the Zoological Museum in Odessa, but his academic career had basically hit a brick wall. The state offered him a professorship on condition that he convert to the Russian Orthodox Church. So he left Russia. In 1889, he reaches Paris. He rejoins his mentor, who was now working alongside the legendary Louis Pasteur at the newly established Pasteur Institute. But because it was flooded with applicants, the only post available was as the Institute's librarian, and Haffkine accepted it just in order to gain access. But by the early 1890s, he's back studying bacteriology. Now, what we have to realize is this isn't a sort of an occupation which is confined to a small group of people, because both Europe and Asia are being ravaged by one of the cholera epidemics of the 19th century, and the scientific community is deeply divided on what to do about it. Haffkine focuses on developing a vaccine. He is working basically around the clock, and he comes up with a method to produce a weakened form of the live cholera. Now, obviously, they test it out on animals, but he realizes it could only reveal so much, so he decides to risk his own life to prove the safety of his creation. And on the 18th of July 1892, he self-administered the first human dose of the experimental vaccine, and it was a success. He reports his findings to the Biological Society on the 30th of July, and it would significantly change the world.
How many lives did he save as a result?
Many. We will come to data later once he travels.
But presumably in the hundreds of thousands.
Absolutely. But it only comes into existence because of his courage. Now, in the short term, his dramatic self-inoculation caused a sensation in the press, but it didn't win over the scientific elite. His colleagues at the Pasteur Institute were not convinced, and the medical establishments in France and Germany refused to adopt his vaccine for public use. Now, normally, Russia would have been a perfect petri dish. They would have experimented because, a few thousand dead citizens never bothered them, and Haffkine wanted Russia to save what are, in effect, his fellow countrymen. But the Tsarist government preferred to let thousands die rather than allow a Jewish scientist who had left the country to treat its citizens. So he realizes that Europe is closed. And he tries to get to India because hundreds of thousands of people are dying there annually. He needed to be officially sent, which, it obviously wasn't going to happen on its own, so he starts this, I guess you could call it a campaign of diplomacy, and eventually the British ambassador to France gets him an invitation to demonstrate his findings in England, and in 1893 they agree to send him.
You would consider him stateless
Yes.
at this point.
Yes.
So stateless Jewish scientist from Odessa, he managed to convince the British government to send him to India.
Yes, but it's by far not in the bag for him. Because he gets there, he is confronted by problems immediately. Firstly, the British colonial authorities required that any participation in his vaccine be voluntary, which meant he couldn't select a group of test subjects. Secondly, they might have granted him permission, but in typical British bureaucratic fashion, they refused to give him any financial support. So he has to fund any medical operation from his own pocket. Third problem was the unpredictability of the cholera outbreaks. In other words, his plan had been to select a village with cholera, vaccinate half of the local population, wait for the next outbreak, and then compare the survival rates. He discovers, however, that the disease rarely returned to the exact same spot, although his personal records reveal that he is travelling across particularly northern India in that first year. He successfully vaccinated more than 20,000 people. And his breakthrough occurs in 1894. There is I guess you could call a sympathetic medical officer in Calcutta who invites him to examine an isolated village. The residents there all take their water, their drinking water, from one single water tank, which Haffkine is convinced is heavily contaminated with cholera. And he administers his vaccine to the entire village, and the results are undeniable. The vast majority of death occurs amongst those who had refused the vaccine. And at this point, the health officials in Calcutta agreed to finance a much wider clinical trial, and he became the first scientist in history to successfully bring laboratory medicine out of Europe into the slums of an undeveloped country. And he travels across the subcontinent, days and weeks, inoculating as many people as possible.
But beyond the physical work that this entailed, was it actually dangerous to him?
Well, I mean, put it this way. India at the time did not exactly have a sophisticated medical system.
Still doesn't.
Right. So I guess there's an ongoing danger of getting infected. But besides which, there was this mad episode where he survived an assassination attempt by a group of religious fanatics. I'm not exactly sure of the details. So, I guess it was risky. And he works non-stop until the autumn of 1895. He then contracts severe malaria, and he is exhausted. He is forced to travel back to England to recuperate. And by the time he left India, he had personally vaccinated nearly 50,000 people. He comes back in 1896 to see the results, and it reveals that cholera had decreased by a staggering 80% amongst those vaccinated. But then in October, a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague hit the city of Bombay. And the mortality rate of that is double of cholera. And the government asks him to assist. But how? There is no vaccine. So he embarks on developing the world's first vaccine. But the conditions under which he's working are primitive. He has a makeshift lab in the corridor of the Grant Medical College in Bombay, and he's working almost entirely by himself. He has an absolute round-the-clock schedule, and the intense physical and emotional strain of the research took a heavy toll. After 3 months, one of his assistants suffered a complete nervous breakdown, and 2 others quit the project. But he developed a working solution in 3 months.
How's that even possible? If we look recently at what happened with COVID, when the entire world was desperately trying to create a vaccine and it took longer than that, how was he physically able to do it in shorter?
I mean, I don't know enough about biology to give you an answer to that question, but I will tell you that he was driven to save lives, not to make a name for himself in the international community. And once again, he tried out the vaccine on himself first. In January 1897, he risks his life again. And following the outcome, the Aga Khan gave him a proper building for his expanding operations. And in fact, to build public trust, the Aga Khan offered himself and thousands of members of his community for immediate vaccination. And within a single year, hundreds of thousands of Indians were successfully inoculated. And by the turn of the 20th century, it had reached 4 million people, and data shows that his vaccine therefore saved the lives of over 1 million people.
That's a crazy number, and we've never heard of him.
Yeah, I mean, doctors obviously have,
Right.
but we,
the layman.
Right, we haven't, and religious Jews haven't, and we really should have, as we will see later. And his scientific triumphs resonate around the world. They force even his biggest adversaries to acknowledge him. I mean, to the degree that in 1898 there was a cholera outbreak in the Russian Empire. Now, the Tsarist government are still absolutely opposed, antagonistic to him personally, but they send 2 Russian scientists to Bombay to study his methods firsthand. He's happy to share it, and they bring it back to Russia, and the vaccine becomes known sort of popularly as Haffkine's lymph, and it's distributed across the country. In Great Britain, he is made a Companion of the Order of the Indian Empire by Queen Victoria, and this honour caught the attention of the global press, including the Jewish Chronicle, which published an editorial that noted with great pride, "A Ukrainian Jew trained in the schools of European science saves the lives of Hindus and Mohammedans and is decorated by the descendant of William the Conqueror and Alfred the Great." And he now becomes a British subject in 1900 because, as you mentioned earlier, he was stateless until this moment in time. And Dr. Joseph Lister, who's the father of modern surgery, called Haffkine a saviour of humanity. But despite these international awards, he faces intense opposition. In India, there are a significant number of British colonial officials and military officers who are obstinate that the way to fight epidemics is the traditional sort of heavy-handed methods of forcibly washing infected homes with fire hoses using lime and basically herding thousands of affected people into isolation camps and hospitals. And he is surrounded by basically envious establishment scientists and a very prejudiced British colonial bureaucracy because they're unhappy about a Russian-born Jew heading their medical operation.
What you're saying was motivated by anti-Semitism?
As well as prejudice against Russians. He had everything going for him, shall we say. And in 1898, he establishes the Bnei Yisrael Plague Hospital to protect the local Indian Jewish community, the Bnei Yisrael Jews there. And British officials viewed this as insubordination. They accused him of tribal favoritism and using his scientific stature to subvert British military rule. And they became they started referring to him in official documents not as a British scientist, but as a foreign Jew whose loyalties lay with his own people rather than the British crown. And you have the political tension between the British and the Russians, and therefore his background becomes a weapon for his detractors. And between 1899 and 1901, anonymous reports are circulating by Haffkine's own staff to the locals that Haffkine is actually a Russian spy using his mass vaccination campaigns to gain the trust of the locals for a future Russian invasion. And this is basically the classic anti-Semitic accusation of the stateless dual-loyal Jew. And then they add to that a rumor that his vaccine was intentionally manufactured using pig and cow flesh. These are sacred animals. And although the rumor started from local, you could call them anti-vaxxers, but the British colonial administrators deliberately delayed issuing any official statements to debunk the myth, because by allowing the rumour to fester, they hoped it would discredit his laboratory. And they strip him of any control. They now take charge of new employment and postings. He is isolated within his own institution. And then there is the flashpoint that the British wanted. 19 villagers died of tetanus in October 1902, and the British establishment did not conduct a standard scientific review. They launched an immediate character assassination. This was the opportunity his enemies had been waiting for. All 19 villagers had been inoculated from a single bottle of Haffkine's vaccine. They contracted tetanus, they died within days of each other, and the other 88 villagers who were treated on that day remained perfectly healthy. And this disaster, the evidence, according to the British, pointed to localized contamination of the single bottle of vaccine. Now we have to realise that the sterilisation method had recently been changed to be based on pure heating, which had been used safely in Paris for 2 years but was relatively new to the British Empire. And the government commission concluded that this laboratory heating process was the definitive source of the contamination, and they charged him with negligence. And basically, nowadays, contemporary historians and scientists refer to it as the Little Dreyfus affair, because it was a kangaroo court of inquiry, and it ruled that the bottle had been contaminated under his direct supervision, basically holding him personally responsible, so they fired him. They took away his title, they sent him back to England in disgrace, and he's not just being suspended for a medical accident. He is being purged because of his faith, his background, his brilliance, because a Jew is a Jew, then, now, and in the future. And it was shameful. He spends the next 4 years in England trying to clear his reputation. The Indian government delayed publishing its full formal findings until 1906, although as soon as the full text of the report became public, the international scientific community immediately came to his defence. You find Professor Simpson wrote to the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, which dismantled the Commission's findings. He pointed out that if the vaccine bottle had been contaminated back in the lab in Bombay, the long transit time would have led to a far stronger growth of the tetanus toxins. And he said the local assistant in Punjab who handled that specific bottle had been seen dropping an instrument directly onto the dirty floor and didn't properly re-sterilize it before opening this vial. And basically, therefore, it's a blood libel. You know, they're accusing him that basically he wanted these Indians dead, despite all the evidence pointing elsewhere.
But what about his reputation and the fact that he saved millions of lives? Didn't that help the case at all?
They wanted rid of him. And it was only the medical fraternity that felt otherwise. So you have Dr. Joseph Lister's prestigious institute in Britain launches a re-investigation of the case, and they confirmed that it was because of the assistant's poor hygiene. And in July 1907, the Times published a letter. It's signed by 10 internationally renowned microbiologists, including Sir Ronald Ross, who was the winner of the 1902 Nobel Prize for Medicine. And the letter declared the case against Haffkine to be distinctly disproven. And they cited the profound injustice of wrongfully accusing one of humanity's greatest benefactors. And in November, his case was finally sent to the British Parliament, and eventually Haffkine was granted permission to return to active service in India. So he comes back to Bombay, and he finds that his post at the lab has been permanently occupied by another scientist. He was offered a compromise position as the director-in-chief of the Calcutta Biological Laboratory, but he finds out that even after his formal exoneration, his name, his scientific reputation is permanently tainted. The British imposed strict restrictions on his work, and they barred him from conducting any practical clinical trials. So he is now confined entirely to basically desk-bound research, no field work, but he continues. Nevertheless, He works there for the next sort of 8 years, I think it is, because he's a doctor and he's committed to helping people. And in 1915, he reaches the age of required civil service retirement. It was mandatory. And he leaves India for good. He eventually settles in Lausanne in Switzerland, where he spent the last 15 years of his life. And here's the interesting thing. During those last few years, he became profoundly religious, returning to full Orthodox Jewish practice. He spends his remaining days learning Gemara, and he used his personal fortune to support European institutions of Torah, because Haffkine credited the spiritual leaders, the heads of the especially Eastern European yeshivas, with ensuring the survival of the Jewish people through the exile. And in 1916, he is in the United States to sort of observe American Jewish life firsthand. He writes an essay called A Plea for Orthodoxy, in which he pushed for religious observance. He denounced the widespread lack of practice amongst secular Western Jews. And he provides what you might call a scientifically framed defense of orthodoxy. And he says that the performance of mitzvahs is not a burden, it's a vital mechanism. Because if you have a community scattered across the world, it can't survive on sentiment or on history alone. It requires daily actions. And he ties this directly to the biblical commandment in the Shema, v'dibarta bom. You have to pass this on. And he says if an individual stops practicing, they inevitably lose faith. So he advocates for kashrus, both, by the way, as a health measure, because he says that the researchers in microbiology have proven that the removal of blood from the heart and vascular systems of the animal underlies the health, preserving health. But he says beyond that, kashrus forces a Jew to think of his religious and communal allegiance at every meal.
Do we know why he suddenly became frum?
He had always retained an element of belief of orthodoxy. He'd never turned his back on that. He never became secular. The circumstances under which he lived did not really allow him to do much more than that, but it was always there within, and when he had the opportunity, he went for it fully. I mean, he... given what we mentioned about the beginnings of reform, he objects strongly to modifying tefillah, to substituting Hebrew with the local language. He says it's important to have visible signs of faith, especially tzitzis. And he says, the youth make a mistake when they demand that every idea be justified by their own modern, incomplete logic before they choose to practice it. He could have been writing this in the 21st century, but he wrote it a century earlier. And then he makes a personal observation. I found myself deprived of intimate communion with fellow Jews for many years. Throughout those years, I obtained consolation and support from endeavoring to observe our specific laws to the best of my knowledge and ability. And he actually says that the birth of science comes from Jewish thought. His last line in this is, "This sum total of the scientific discoveries of all lands and times is an approach of the world's thought to our Adon Olam." In 1919, he established the Haffkine Foundation for Jewish Education with a particular focus reaching out to secular Jews. And in his will, he leaves funds to yeshivas to the degree that Diana Brumsky praised him for understanding the spiritual value of yeshiva education. And he sent a formal petition after World War I demanding full religious rights to the oppressed Jews of Eastern Europe, which was presented to world leaders in Versailles. And the Sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe engaged him to provide international stature to support Jews suffering under the anti-religious policies of communist Russia. And in 1907, he wrote to the United States expressing thanks for its humanitarian treatment of Jewish immigrants. And he says, I hope the settlers will preserve in their new home an unshaken fidelity to the creed of their ancestors and that there will arise among them great citizens who will repay by their services the hospitality afforded to them. And on the 26th of October 1930, he passed away in Switzerland at the age of 70, and he left his extensive personal archive to the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem.
It's a remarkable story, and as you said, it's a bigger surprise now that we've never heard of him.
Yeah.
Was he ever honoured in his later years?
I don't believe anything really happened in his lifetime, not that I've come across. In the 1960s, India issued a commemorative postage stamp. I saw a picture of it. And Israel did so in the 1990s. But the world remains largely unaware, I would say, both of his scientific achievements at great cost and of his from life.
What about his work? Can it be seen anywhere?
I mean, a layman's version can be, because one of his most precious artifacts is on display at the Tower of David Museum in Jerusalem. It's an original sealed cholera vaccine glass from his very first batch, manufactured in Paris, and it was found wrapped in a small package which had a note written by Haffkine himself, dated September 1892, just a few months after his dramatic self-experimentation, and he writes, "This glass bottle contains the definitive antidote for cholera." Now, today most people can identify Louis Pasteur for his work on rabies or Jonas Salk for conquering polio, but the name of Mordechai Wolff Haffkine, a proud Orthodox Jew who brought medicine to the slums of Asia and who developed vaccines against two of the biggest killers in human history by risking his own life, is not really known.
And in terms of sheer numbers, he must be up there with the life saved, right?
Yes, yeah. I did actually check, and if we can believe AI on anything, he's not the number one, but he's in the top 10 of people who've saved lives in history. So, from one life, let's move to a very different one. Dr. Samuel Solomon's name is unlikely to have any particular significance for most people today, even in Liverpool, where he gained most of his fame and fortune. He made his name over 200 years ago on the strength of medicines that he devised and marketed, alongside a legitimate medical degree from an institution that he never attended. He was born in Cork in Ireland around 1745. Cecil Roth describes that there was a shul in Cork in the first half of the 18th century. It had its own sheichet, its own Beis HaKvaros cemetery, all of which were defunct by 1796. And Abraham Solomon was among the local residents, the father of Samuel Solomon. And in 1753, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in London informed those of its Jews who were accustomed to obtain kosher meat in Cork that Abraham Solomons was the only person there qualified to perform shechita. And in fact, there's a pamphlet in 1737 that affirms that shipment of beef and provisions was the most considerable commerce of Jewish Cork, with local Jews engaged in it supplying England as well as Jews living in the faraway West Indies.
So he must have had a religious upbringing, being the son of a sheikh, right?
I mean, traditional, I would imagine, for sure, yes. And his uncle, called Isaac, who lived in Dublin, worked as a pharmacist and called himself Dr. Isaac Solomon. He was the quack from whom his nephew learned various tricks of the trade. And there was another Isaac Solomon, Samuel's younger brother, who was a jeweller and is the only Jew known to have remained in Cork and who died there in 1845. Now, legend tells us that Dr. Samuel Solomon started out as a street urchin selling shoe polish in Newcastle, or possibly hair curlers in Birmingham on Motzei Shabbos after Shabbos was over. But we actually find him in Dublin in 1768, where, presumably with his uncle's advice, he opened a shop for the sale of medicinal remedies, and an advertisement in the Dublin press reads as follows: Dr. Solomon in Fleet Street, having performed many cures on persons with scurvies, cancers and evils, thinks it is his duty to inform the public thereof, that his medicines may become more useful by being more generally known. The certificates in his possession can leave no room to doubt their veracity and the efficacy of his medicines.
How did he become successful?
Well, this period of time sees really a dramatic expansion of what you might call the commercial market of medicines. It's fueled by the newspapers and based on, I guess, widespread clinical anxiety, which is not a new thing. And you have a competitive market, in fact, of itinerant healers and locals, but few people achieved the astronomical wealth and cultural reputation and indeed marketing supremacy of Dr. Samuel Solomons. He transformed what is basically a mixture of alcohol and spices into an empire which was centered on what he called his cordial balm of Gilead. And he carried out brilliant advertising throughout the British Isles.
What was their name?
It comes from Yirmiyahu. It's a liquid mentioned there of great value. And
what's it made of?
Well, the primary base was high-proof French brandy or wine, lemon peels and Spanish fly, which is an ingredient which is illegal today, turpentine, and various bitter herbs blended into the mix, basically in order to create a medicinal taste and to hide any alcoholic odours. And he creates this delicious tonic which tasted good. And, of course, the ingredients were kept secret, and he purchases different things in different towns. But the rumours were that it had old French wine laced with spices from the Holy Land and even dissolved gold. But it has to be said that unlike many of his contemporaries, this balm of Gilead contained no opium, which spared its consumers from narcotic poisoning, but it didn't prevent addiction because of its high alcohol content.
So in those days, you could just make any concoction and market it as being medicinal. There was no government body yet.
Much more than that. Because in the early 1790s, he moves to Liverpool. And he is accused there by some of being uneducated. So he buys a medical degree from a college in Aberdeen, which you could do in those days if you got two doctors to countersign. And this legal transaction allows him to call himself Doctor of Medicine legally on his pamphlets, and it gives him this veneer. So never mind you could make the concoction, you could be an accredited, acknowledged doctor. And not surprisingly, the sales of this cure-all were phenomenal. Its reputation spread, although some probably mistook inebriation for the natural glow of renovated health and became alcoholics. Now, the standard dosage is somewhere between 2 teaspoons to 1 tablespoon 3 times a day. And you have to realise this is not just the UK. He made a lucrative 3-year tour of the States. You have here this Liverpool Jew with a medical degree from Aberdeen, and he has a book called Guide to Health, which he sold in New York, and it advertised marvellous cures. And he had Solomon's drops for stubborn conditions.
How expensive was it that he made a fortune of it?
A single small bottle was half a guinea, which is 10 shillings and sixpence, while a large bottle was 33 shillings. And to put these sums into perspective, a typical worker in late 18th century England earned approximately 10 shillings and sixpence a week. And the large bottle is therefore more than 3 weeks of labour. So, yes, he is earning a fortune. Meanwhile, in Liverpool, he met and married Elizabeth Aaron, the eldest daughter of Moses Aaron, who was a Birmingham pencil maker and a rabbi. She's 29 and he is 15 years older than her. It's unlikely that Moses Aaron would have allowed his daughter to marry a completely non-observant Jew, but we don't know how observant he was, although we do find the following from the Old Hebrew Congregation in Liverpool, July 11th, 1808. My dear sir, written to him, I am to acknowledge receipt of 10 guineas, which you please to hand me on the 9th, as a donation towards the completion of our new synagogue. Permit me to thank you as this mark of your attention and liberality, particularly as it was unsolicited, which is quite interesting. In other words, he gave that just because. With sincere regard for Mrs. Solomon and family, Elias Joseph, Treasury and Secretary.
Right, although a donation to a shul doesn't necessarily mean observance on any level. So you're basically describing an impostor who made money by selling naive people around the world bogus remedies, right? Assuming nothing worked.
Well, the truth is, this is at a time where qualified doctors are often favouring things like bloodletting. So
what's that mean?
They would use leeches or cupping to remove bad blood.
Right.
And they probably killed more patients than
It's an era of guesswork.
Yes. And he did offer sensible advice about personal hygiene, and he offered healthy placebos. So the beneficial effect on some is clear because there are testimonials quoted in his Guide to Health and in numerous advertisements.
Every good lie has a bit of truth.
Yeah. And there was another so-called physician called Brodem, who was actually born as Yisachar Cohen in Copenhagen, who also came to England and was involved in similar activities. And when a physician published defamatory remarks about him, Brodem threatened legal action, and he got a settlement and a retraction, and he even managed to overcome the efforts by the Royal College of Physicians to have the brass doctor's plate removed from his house. He said, I am a doctor. I have purchased this MD. And the Solicitor General felt that there was nothing you could do about it. Going back to Samuel Solomon himself, his wealth and prestige enabled him to become a known figure in local society. He carried a gold-topped cane, he made friends with top people, and Madame Tussaud decided to add him to her waxwork gallery of celebrities and came especially from London to make a cast of his features. So he was on the map. Now, he purchased a burial plot in the Jewish cemetery in Manchester. The paperwork we have tells us as follows. We, the undersigned, being the Jewish congregation of Manchester, in consideration of the sum of £10 and 10 shillings paid to our manager by Mr. Samuel Solomon of Liverpool, Doctor of Medicine, grant and acknowledge the said Samuel Solomon to have a sufficient place in our burial ground lying in Pendleton in Manchester that will contain the said Samuel Solomon when he may depart his life, and also sufficient space and ground to contain Elizabeth, the wife of the said, and the children of the said Samuel or Elizabeth Solomon, as long as they have lawfully begotten in wedlock their offspring, according to the Jewish rites and ceremony, being such as are acceptable to the Jewish synagogue. And then it adds, if they have not converted to any other religion, when it shall please God to take away the life of him or of any of his or her children. Now, at the same time, he actually built a burial plot and mausoleum on his own private land. And when he dies in 1819, he's buried there. It's a very expensive private building in Mossley Hill. And so are 6 other family members, and decades later, the London and North Western Railway Company bought the Mossley estate, and the remains of the family were reinterred in a place which is now Grant Gardens.
Fascinating. Well, that's a Jewish cemetery?
I don't believe so.
Well, so what does remain of him? Does he have any legacy at all?
Well, we've got a drawing of him. With a fake coat of arms. We also have bottles, which at one point did contain his elixir. We've got adverts. We've even got an 8-page promotional pamphlet with details of his clinical claims and legal oaths. But there's no mansion, no surviving balm, although I have to tell you that in the 1860s, Liverpool did ensure that the memory of this entrepreneur would be perpetuated in 3 streets: Balm, Gilead and Solomon.
That's not bad. For his reputation, 3 streets.
Yes, and it's quite impressive because about 5 minutes walk away from there, in a place where Gilead House once stood, there are another 3 streets named after Liverpudlians, but each only has 1 street, and I think they were a little bit more famous, 4 actually. You now have John Lennon Drive, George Harrison Close, Paul McCartney Way, and Ringo Starr Drive.
A bit more famous, yeah.
Yes, for those who are of an age. And James Joyce, who is the famous writer and the author of Ulysses, knew all about this Irish-born Dr. Solomon and his Guide to Health, and he even refers to him and his Balm of Gilead.
But from our perspective, as a hopefully not too from Jew, he was a crook. Because although you said that many doctors were sort of shooting from the hip, there was an intent to deceive people, the way you describe it.
I'm not sure that it counts as deception. The very fact that he was allowed to be legally doing what he is doing quite openly, it's not as if he cut a corner or 2. His entire fortune was based on what he manufactured, the ingredients of which he never revealed, and it was done very openly, and the country allowed it to continue. This was considered entirely legitimate at the time. And yes, you're right. He wasn't a doctor, and therefore he wasn't curing, he wasn't a surgeon, he wasn't in any way...
The question is if he thought he was curing people.
I don't know.
We'll never know.
That's a good question, yes. Although I will conclude with a limerick written by an anonymous wit. Great Solomon has gone, his house and sepulchre and balm. If his mixture did mankind no good, at least it did no harm.
Right. Although it may have caused some alcoholics to rise from in America and across the world.
Although I'll tell you, if you go back to the 1700s and even the 1800s, and we'll probably touch on this next week, sterile environments, etc., were so unknown that doctors were killing their patients by not having adequate preparation and clean environments. Surgery was life-threatening to most patients.
It's interesting because you think of the mitzvah of Rappa Yerape, which is known to be a heta to go to doctors, right? Because otherwise you would think you're interfering with God's plan. Until recently, going to doctors was a very risky and dangerous business. It's almost like you needed a heta just on a practical sense. It was a flip the coin.
I guess that's true, yes. And now we will take the historical to the practical and halachic, when circumstances end up being quite different to what was expected. Rabbi Zilberstein has a 10-volume work on medical halacha. We will confine ourselves to 4 pages. The question is as follows. A young boy needed a kidney transplant, and his mother was a good match. The woman hired an excellent private surgeon to perform the surgery, but the surgeon mistakenly removed her left kidney instead of the right one. But upon examination, this kidney was found to be riddled with cancer. If he had removed the right kidney, the cancer would have spread and she would not have been able to survive. So Hashem guided the surgeon to save the woman's life. You now have 2 questions. Firstly, is the physician obligated to pay the woman for damages? And the opposite question, is the physician, if he is halachically exempt from paying for damages, can he now charge the woman for the surgery he performed, which, in spite of his negligence, saved her life? So, he writes as follows. Regarding the first question, the starting point would be whether we follow the thoughts of a person or the result of his action. It's a machlokes in the Gemara Menachos. If a person spreads out a net on Shabbos to trap and catch fish, which is an Issa D'Oraisa, one of the 39 Melachos, and instead he pulls in a child who is drowning in the sea, Rabba says he is exempt for breaking Shabbos. Rova says he is guilty. Rabba says because his action in retrospect saved a child's life. Rava says we look at the intention. The Rambam rules like Rabba that he is exempt, and the Chazon Ish explains that the act clearly saved life. And although he sinned in thought, there's no prohibited action, and you're not held accountable generally for your thoughts. However, the question is, does this apply to damage? We might differentiate between Shabbos and Nezek and damages because doing a prohibited act on Shabbos is set aside when there's danger to life, because saving a life is not considered Chilul Shabbos, it's not desecrating Shabbos. On the other hand, the prohibition, the Issa, of damaging somebody's body or assets doesn't cease to exist when there is danger to life.
But we will still require proof that the act is not called an act of damage, but one of saving a life.
Yes. So, first to look at several similar cases too. Reuven drove carelessly and he hit Shimon, who required medical attention, but he now missed his flight as a result. It turned out that the plane he missed crashed with no survivors. Is Reuven responsible to pay Shimon for the damages he caused, or to ask mechila, to ask forgiveness? Second question. A teacher spoke badly about her student, but as a result, the student got engaged because the mother of a boy asked for information about a certain girl for a shidduch, and one of the questions she asked the girl's teacher was, what is the level of her honesty and moral conscience? And the teacher answered that is not one of her strong points. Several days later, the teacher heard that the girl was engaged to the boy whose mother had phoned her. And the mother told her it was specifically the information that honesty was not one of her strong points that allowed the shidduch to happen because of the nature of business deals the family is involved in. The teacher would like to know whether she needs to ask mechila from her student for what she said.
Or maybe she should get a shatchonos fee.
So in the first case, whereas Shimon would forgive Reuven, Reuven does have to pay for the damage he caused because it wasn't his action that directly saved life. The wound didn't save him. It was the delay. And this is also the psak of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. And in the second case, to the young man's family, it actually wasn't Lashon Hara. It was Lashon Tov. And we can refer to the Chofetz Chaim, who wrote that if you ask for information from a person for making a shidduch, really you should explain why you're asking in order to differentiate between Lashon Hara and Lashon Tov. But let's go back to our first question regarding a surgeon who mistakenly removed the wrong kidney. The physician is exempt for paying for the injury because he did no damage because he removed a cancerous kidney. And it's similar to the actions of Reb Gamliel, who freed his servant by blinding him. In fact, it's even better than that, because there he did an action which in itself was wrong. Here the physician unknowingly did a mitzvah of saving the woman's life. At the same time, it would possibly or probably be correct for the authorities to revoke the physician's license or punish him in a different way for his negligence. Although Hashem chose the physician as a shliach to save the woman's life, he is still responsible for the negligence. Does she have to pay him? So the Chidah says, if your intent is to do damage and it turned out to be a benefit, you do not deserve payment because your intent was not to benefit, so you could say that the woman is exempt. However, Rav Liashiv says the woman benefited from the surgery that saved her life, so she's obligated to pay the physician, but she doesn't have to pay the price they agreed on in the beginning, the price of surgery for transplants, which needs special expertise. Rather, she should pay him the price paid to a regular surgeon for removing a diseased kidney.
Well, very interesting. How about suing the doctor, which will probably ruin his reputation, and his livelihood would suffer as a result? Would you be allowed to do that?
It's an extension of these questions. It's beyond my knowledge, but I'm sure Rabbi Zilberstein deals with it at some stage. But we end tonight with a look at the latest from the BBC, related to, but not about, Israel. You may be aware that Congress's most prominent anti-Israel Republican was involved last week in the most expensive campaign in US history to get re-elected. He's been a congressman in Kentucky since 2012, and he recently hosted a group of supporters, including one wearing an American Reich sweatshirt, on Friday before the election. He was challenged by a guy called Ed Galrain, and I read an article from the JTA which described Massie and his activities as follows. Massie is part of a growing anti-Israel cohort on the right, the type who are mainstreaming anti-Semitism and Nazi rhetoric. His ongoing criticism of President Donald Trump on issues including Israel and Iran prompted Trump to back Galrain. Most polling shows an extremely close race between them. He's the most anti-Israel Republican in the House. And he was the only member of Congress in 2022 to vote against a resolution that condemned anti-Semitism. He argued that it limited free speech. He criticized US support for Israel. He voted against a resolution that condemned the BDS movement. And in 2023, he voted against a resolution that equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. In 2025, he voted against continued funding for the Iron Dome missile defense system in Israel. He voted against supporting American intervention in Iran this year. And at times, he is the only Republican siding with left-wing Democrats on Israel votes. So we understand why the Jews were against him and the relief that he lost 55 to 45. But this is how our truth-seeking, angelic, objective, peace-loving, biased broadcasting corporation describes the same Thomas Massie the day after he lost. Listen out for how they describe his anti-Israel stance. And I quote, Congressman Thomas Massie, one of the most vocal Republican critics of Donald Trump, has lost his fight for re-election to a challenger endorsed by the president. Massie, who has been in office since 2012, publicly broke with Trump by voting against his big beautiful tax and spending bill last year over concerns about national debt. He has also voted to curtail Trump's attacks on suspected drug boats in the Caribbean. Massie also joined with Democrats and a handful of Republicans to force Trump's Department of Justice to release all of its files on Jeffrey Epstein. In his concession speech, Massie said voters has indicated they wanted someone who would go along to get along, but added there is a yearning in this country for somebody who will vote for principles over party. He criticized the administration's foreign aid spending, the large donations to his opponent, etc. Hang on, that's it? What about the fact that Massie is anti-Israel and consorts with neo-Nazis? Nothing in the BBC, not a word, because it would gall the BBC to write that support for Israel can get you elected. It goes against everything they wish for and try to portray. In Judaism, we define two types of lies, commission and omission. Commission is an actual lie. I say something false, and that lie exists because of what I said. Omission means I didn't give you all the details. I conveniently left things out. And the BBC will say, I didn't lie about Massie. There's nothing to apologise for. I didn't misquote him. The lie of not telling the truth. And very tellingly, when Massie conceded the election on Tuesday night, he did so with a sarcastic remark about Galrain's relationship to Israel. And he said, I would have come out sooner, but I had to call my opponent and concede first. And it took a while to find Ed Galrain in Tel Aviv. No comment.
Yes, well, that was quite a colourful episode. We start off with a good doctor, a legend, to a questionable doctor, to very interesting Shilas and Chuvas. So we've really covered a lot of ground tonight. Looking forward to part 2 next week, where we will be featuring Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz and potentially another surprise guest. Please, as always, send in your questions, feedback and comments to podcast@jle.org.uk. And we thank you for listening.